Hello everyone, this is Dr. Gear and this is Unit 2, Chapter 2 of EDAD 635, and today's topic is on human resources planning. I will be trying this in a couple of different software packages to see which one works best for you at the other end. The present software package I'm using is called Camtasia, and I think that there was some problems with PowerPoint and Camtasia, and that's why we were having some issues yesterday with this particular sound issue that many of you are having. I'm going on to the second slide now, and that is called Assessing Human Resource Needs, and basically that's the topic of this chapter, and these are the four items that the chapter reviews and are really the foundation by which a human resources staff person works. I will tell you that for a building level person, the type of skills that you will employ in human resources is going to look a little bit different than what the person at a district office position does as a human resource manager or director. However, it's important for you as a future building level leader, and perhaps even ascending at some point in your career to one of these other positions in district office, to understand how this person works within the system, and certainly has a most important influence on the school district. Further, I would say that for you as a school principal and interacting with a person who holds this position, it's very important that you develop a rapport and relationship so that a sense of trust develops between the two of you, and as a result you can have some very frank conversations and get the needs of your particular building outlined for this person. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Human resource inventories are a key for both the human resources staff person and the principal. And I would say that oftentimes that this is really a neglected piece when it comes to the building level in terms of having this formalized in some fashion. This is an area where you as the building principal can work with your administrative staff to set up a database that will be a place that you can find a myriad of information at your fingertips. I would comment that often this is missing an incomplete piece because it's one of those items that in the day-to-day life of your school you're kind of thinking, well, I'll get to that when I can. But I will tell you that organizing this and having it at your fingertips at any given time with the proper information on it is invaluable. I would suggest to you that whether you are a central office or a district office personnel person or a principal, that you begin to build a database, and I would suggest that you include the following: hiring dates, dates that the person is put before the board and actually approved by the board, because often there will be policy that will influence reduction in force or RIFs or layoffs later. For instance, sometimes the policy may be that if employees were on the agenda and approved by the board for positions on a given night, and they have the same certification and we're teaching the same subject, it could be alphabetical who gets laid off first. For that reason, it's very important to keep these records, and as a building principal, be familiar with the school system's policy when it comes to reduction in force. A good database also will include things such as the date that the person is first in the retirement system. And the reason that I bring that up to you is that this employee may come to you and already have accrued years in the retirement system in South Carolina or some other state where there is a reciprocal acknowledgement. As a result of that, later in the person's career and for your own planning purposes, it's important that you have this date so that if the employee needs it or for your own planning purposes, you have access to this person's official entry into the retirement system. Things like their birth date, their certifications that they have, and other such information as you may deem relevant is best captured in these databases and will assist you in planning. Also, in these profiles, you may want to indicate race and ethnicity to identify needs for addressing affirmative action issues. The other thing that you can identify is whether or not your staff is becoming heavily weighted in with one gender or another, or some other type of hiring pattern that may be happening either consciously or unconsciously. I'm going on to the next slide. This slide deals with enrollment projections, and enrollment projections are one of the basic tools for school districts for planning purposes. And as the slide points out, the basic answer of an enrollment prediction is to try to determine how many children will be in the district or at a particular school over the next upcoming time period. One of the things that I would suggest to you is that oftentimes there seems to be some kind of smoke and mirrors around enrollment predictions, but they really are pretty simple to do, and you as a principal certainly can put together a database that will provide you with the tools to do enrollment predictions. It's as simple as filling in an Excel spreadsheet that shows enrollment at each level for a time period past and your present. For instance, you may be able to gather attendance information at your school for the past 10 years at each grade level. What I would suggest to you is insert that into an Excel spreadsheet with each grade level being shown and the information from your feeder schools, and you can just feed this through grade level by grade level up and through 12 years. I know that sounds a bit daunting verbally, but I think if you sit down and take a look at it and think about it, it's really not that hard to push a student's kindergarten class may number 100 today, to push that 12 years through the future. Obviously, you're going to lose some students along the way. However, you'd be surprised if you track this information between people coming into your school and people leaving. It's pretty accurate and it remains pretty constant. There are some circumstances that certainly could change that if there was some type of severe economic downturn in your area and major employers have laid off lots of people, and as a result they have to migrate to get employment. In the Horry County region, it really is probably more the other way, in the sense that there's lots of building going on and it's a growing area, versus, say, for instance, the more rural areas that we deal with in our cohort with Georgetown, Williamsburg, Marion, and Dillon, who are more struggling for employment opportunities for people in their communities. So the point of that discussion is that the conditions around enrollment predictions are a function of the economy. They're a function of what's going on in your community. For instance, is there a subdivision being built in your particular area? If so, are the units being sold? I would give you a rule of thumb that demographers will tell you that each of those new houses, if they are sold, will bring you 1.25 students into the system over a period of many, many different houses being put into the equation. One of the things that I would suggest you is that you need to be cognizant of bulges in enrollment. By that I mean at various points in time you will find classes that are larger significantly than others for whatever reason. These put a stress on the system in several ways. First is as they go through the system, providing class sizes and resources for this abnormally large class. Secondly, one of the things that occurs out of this, and this is especially true at the elementary level, is teachers will be hired to take care of this enrollment bulge. One of the things as a personnel manager, both at the district level and as a principal, that I would suggest to you is that if a bulge comes through, you have to be aware that sometimes those bulges fall off on the other side, and now you have hired a number of personnel to take care of students who no longer are there. One of the mistakes that we make oftentimes as education is we do not reduce our workforce in that particular circumstance after the bulge has gone through the system. That leads us to a situation where class sizes certainly diminish, but at some point the economic pressures of that phenomenon are such that you will end up doing a massive reduction in force. The reason that I said that happens at the elementary school more readily is because of the very nature of the curriculum there and the way that it's taught, with each teacher teaching the major subject areas. So when you have a bulge of third graders, you hire a third grade teacher. Such is not the case if you think about middle school and high school with curriculum specialists. When a bulge comes through, do you hire a whole new team to deal with that? Do you hire a half a team? The question has to be one that is contemplated and thought about. And as you might imagine, the enrollment prediction or projection is very key into this idea of being able to plan for the future. Obviously, there are significant budgetary considerations either through the addition or the reduction in force of staff. Moving on to slide 5. School district objectives certainly are the driving force behind the personnel management function. And we all are pretty familiar with the idea that the objective should be to maximize student achievement. Much of what will happen for the school district in terms of its goals and objectives obviously comes through the school board and the superintendent of schools. But I would contend to you as building level leadership that you too have a big role in this. You too will develop an individual vision for your building or area of responsibility in the organization. One of the things that I would suggest to you as an educational leader, no matter what level you have ascended to, is to have a long-term plan. What is it that your vision shows you in terms of the resources that you're going to need to get there? Also keep in mind that you won't be able to get everything you want as an educational leader immediately. It will become a question of how do you allocate your scarce resources, both money and personnel, and how do you reallocate them over the long term? So as an effective personnel manager and also manager and leader of an educational organization, you have to keep constantly assessing that question of allocation. Am I doing this as effectively and efficiently as I can? Are there other ways that I could organize time, people, other resources in order to best facilitate the educational program? Where does the superintendent and the Board of Ed, what direction are they pushing you to, and what do you need to do to be successful in achieving that? Because that will be the basis by which your performance will be judged. One of the things that I would suggest to you that oftentimes is articulated as a way in which to deal with short-term funding issues is to get grant funding. I would caution you, grants are wonderful, but two things I would caution you about. One is they usually have a lot of paperwork attending them, and as a building level administrator or a district level administrator, grants are an add-on. And one of the things that I would suggest you is that if you ever write a grant, is make sure you write in enough in the grant to have a grant administrator, whether that's you relieved of some duties or the actual hiring of someone to administer the grant. The second caution I would give you about grant funding when it comes to achieving school district objectives is that it's a short-term, one-shot injection usually. By that I mean you're going to get a pool of funds that may fund your project for several years, but what happens when that grant is over? Now somehow you're going to have to backfill to continue to fund the personnel and other resources that you have been funding with this grant. If you take a look at the last portion of the slide, they talk about a 5-year period, and 5-year plans are always something that are articulated by strategic planners. As a person who spent a lot of time in the field, I would caution you again that 5-year plans are good, but your planning should be occurring all the time. It should not be an event. It should be something that's occurring all the time. In other words, conditions change rapidly, and as a result of that, you need to be able to make sure that your goals and objectives can be manipulated so that you can still achieve them based upon the conditions around you. In other words, I think it's no use to have these beautiful 5-year plans in vinyl binders somewhere with their objectives that are essentially unattainable because of changes in conditions. I kind of use the idea when thinking about this that we're sort of dressing someone up and then not taking him or her to the dance. In the long term, if you go through this exercise and it never comes to fruition, one of the issues that will come up is your own competence as a leader. In other words, people say, well, you know what, they planned for this thing way down the road and we never got there. So it was a frustrating exercise that did not bear any fruit. So one of the things I would suggest you is keep on top of those plans. Make sure you dust them off regularly. Make sure that the goals in them are still relevant and the objectives or way that you were working to reach those goals are still relevant and practical. I'm going on to the next slide at this point. The next slide talks about human resource forecasting. And I think in essence it summarizes to some extent what we've been talking about previously. We've been talking about enrollment projections, we've been talking about goals and objectives, which are all integral to the planning process. But one of the things that I would suggest to you is that forecasting is very important for a reason that I just spoke to you about. There's no sense building this elaborate plan around places that you can't get to. For instance, I'll give you an example. It probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to build a Hindi language program or a Mandarin Chinese language program or a highly technical science program into your building or district if you can't possibly find staffing to fulfill the mission of the project. So consider carefully your local conditions, and can you afford it? Will you be able to solicit a teacher for this process? If it's questionable, you should be thinking long and hard about other strategies for recruitment, or perhaps it's just not the right program for your district. If it is, you'll have to put into place conditions around attaining human resources to fulfill that program, which will be part of the course that we talk about in recruitment. One of the things that I would suggest to you is that forecasting is dicey business. For instance, I don't think BP could have forecasted the problems that they're going to have in the Gulf right now. But I would also contend to you that a good manager at BP would have been thinking about the idea of, okay, worst case scenario, what happens here if one of these oil rigs blows up? And let's have a plan in place. Well, that's a function of forecasting to some extent. We've talked about enrollment projections. We've talked about goals and objectives. One of the things that I would propose to you is that there needs to be a lot of communication between the Board of Ed, district office, and building level leaders to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So in other words, it's difficult to forecast where you're going if you don't know where you're going. So in other words, again, you need to be talking to all of the constituents that are leading the district. That's your board, that's your superintendent. It could be some leaders inside the superintendent's cabinet. You have to figure that out as a good building level leader, and you need to continue to articulate to those levels what you need as a leader, manager at perhaps a building or a segment of their organization, because they want you to be successful. So, in other words, in order to forecast, you need to communicate. I don't think you'll find that especially surprising. I'll give you an example. When I was a middle school principal, I became a close professional and personal friend with the human resources director. One of the things that allowed for me was through that relationship that we had built over time, which was based on trust and truth, was that he knew that when I articulated a need to him, that it wasn't smoke and mirrors. And I would suggest that too often in my career I've seen principals make the mistake of using smoke and mirrors when dealing with enrollment projections or other such items that a human resources professional needs. As a result of that, then the human resource person begins to question the veracity of the principal, and it's not a good situation. And I would recommend that you speak the truth to these people, whether it's to your advantage or not, because one of the things that you have to remember as a building principal is that you are but one part of a big system, and it doesn't pay for you to really hog resources that might be better allocated somewhere else within the system. And moving on to the next slide. Slide number 7, we talk about the supply of human resources. And one of the things that I would suggest to you is that beyond what you've seen in REBOR in this slide, is that this is also a function of forecasting, and it's done really kind of in a very informal way. Lots of relationship building, again, will facilitate your ability to understand what your labor supply increase and decrease will look like. And the way that you do that is by establishing relationships with people and to keep communicating with them. For instance, through those conversations, you'll find out who's planning a family in the near term. If it's your only physics teacher in your building, you better start thinking about that. Or perhaps it's your speech and language pathologist at an elementary level where you may have some difficulty replacing that person, and you need to be thinking about a recruitment strategy with the personnel manager. Who's contemplating retirement might be something you'd find out. whose parents are sick, who might need a family medical leave. Those are the types of things that you'll find out usually informally. Keep in mind that these supply issues can be both short and long term in duration when it comes to personnel, but any absence affects the quality of students' education. So as a personnel manager, you need to be considering that regularly and have contingency plans in place as much as possible. For instance, a question I would ask is, do you have an adequate pool of substitutes? If you do not, then you need to be developing that. One of the things that I think people do is they don't think about that and be proactive about acquiring a pool of adequate substitutes until the need punches them in the face, so to speak. So think about that, and as a building principal, if you have good subs, you make their conditions of employment as positive as possible so they want to come back to your building regularly. I'm moving on to the next slide. Slide number 8 deals with probably one of the most distasteful and dirty words for everyone involved in education, and that's reduction in force, often referred to as a RIF. Keep in mind that in this situation, you are affecting people's paychecks, self-image, and the school and district's culture. Again, here's where enrollment projections can be key, and I've discussed with you previously the effect of enrollment bulges, and your job as either a school personnel manager at a district level or again as a principal is to keep your eye on that so that you don't become overstaffed. What happens then when you're overstaffed, your class sizes will begin to diminish, and then you are leaving yourself at the beck and call of people above your head. In other words, now the superintendent's going to be looking at your class size ratios and saying, well, that school's overstaffed. We need to be cutting there. Sometimes it's easier for you to, through that planning process, to understand that a retirement's coming up. How are you going to work to slide some of your best people into openings that may be coming available in the near term or the long term due to death, due to retirement, due to transfer? And I would also suggest to you that this is a place where you might want to keep an eye on your substitute teachers for likely candidates for a teaching position, and also, talking with other principals, developing a network where when reductions in forces occur, you can send somebody a really good teacher, or you may be able to accept a really good custodian into your organization. Again, I've already mentioned to you how RIFs are easier to implement in the elementary school. I would further pose to you that some of the questions that you have to consider in this very sensitive matter of what technically is called a RIF, but what really is a layoff, is how do you deliver the news, when do you deliver the news, and how can you do it in a humane way. I think I've mentioned to you sometime along the way about when we had to do a reduction in force at my last school district. One of the things we saw was it was impending because of, again, an enrollment bulge that had come through the system, and we needed to be cutting back some of our employees because of very, very low class size ratios and also budget issues. So one of the things that we did was we considered when to do it, and we let people know about the layoffs that were impending right before, several weeks before actually, an Easter vacation period, spring vacation of several weeks, with the logic being that if people wanted to work on securing employment and or maybe they were going on an expensive vacation, they may want to change plans. So consider those ideas. How do you tell somebody? How do you make sure you've taken care of their human needs? This is almost like a death in the family when you are doing a layoff. I'd encourage you, if you're ever involved in this, to think it through very carefully and try to be as humane as possible. In some states, they have what are called preferred eligible lists. For instance, if you lay off a teacher in New York, that person goes on a preferred eligible list. So any opening that they are eligible for due to their certification, they have to be offered that position for 7 years after the reduction in force. I do not believe such is true in South Carolina. I went and looked at some of the South Carolina law, and I could not see anything regarding preferred eligible lists. On slide number 8, there are a couple links that I have given you. One is a summary of a person's rights when they're leaving a job, and the second is a summary of South Carolina employment law. I'd encourage you to take a minute and read through those. I'm moving on to slide 9. This deals with federal legislation and how it influences the human resources function. And the first is social justice. And I think if I was going to define that for you, very simply, is that social justice is that our rights as American citizens are rights for all citizens. It's not rights for white people, not right, and they're not just rights for males. It's for everyone. And the reason that I bring that up is that I think that that's an overarching concept that if you use that to think about how you deal or how others deal with various actions that may have to do with law, whether it's employment or suspension or special ed, if you approach the question of law from a social justice perspective, generally you'll be in the right arena in terms of your action. Also, I would point out that social justice means social justice, again, for all. Not those that are the least, not those that are the rich, but for everyone. In terms of affirmative action, most people are pretty familiar with that idea. There's a history of that in your textbook, but basically the idea behind affirmative action obviously was to provide equal opportunity for all in the employment areas, and also in things like college admissions. The EEOC is the regulation and enforcement agency that deals with affirmative action. I'm moving on to slide 10. Here you see, in a quick overview, the EEOC administrative process. You certainly can review that in REBOR. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. I am now going to slide 11. There is a number of items in the next several slides that basically deal with various laws regarding federal involvement in the human resources function. I would suggest to you that you sit down, you outline and understand these in a level of detail that goes beyond what is happening in this PowerPoint. The reason being that these are the framework by which most actions around human resources will be influenced by the federal government. For instance, we have the civil rights legislation that various civil rights legislation, equality for people with disabilities and reasonable accommodations. I'm moving on to slide 12. Here you have ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, I would suggest that you again review this in REBOR, especially understanding the jurisdiction and scope of ADA. One of the things I would suggest to you, though, understand that if you have somebody who applies for a job, that you as a potential employer have the responsibility to provide reasonable accommodation for this person's employment. I'm going on to slide 13. Further civil rights legislation. Uh, AIDS and discrimination, Vietnam era Veterans Readjustment Act. Again, these deal with various ways in which an employer uh, cannot discriminate against employees, and sometimes has even farther reaching implications in terms that it can be applied to the students inside a school district. For instance, the AIDS legislation is a good example, and I'd suggest that if you ought to think about Ryan White, the discrimination he went through. It's a pretty famous historical landmark situation that ended up with this legislation. A couple of different things that you may want to also be aware of: mobilization of military reserves, how that all fits into the human resource function. You have to obviously reserve the job of that person. Uh, the other is the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act. That has to do with drug and alcohol testing of bus drivers, which is anytime they have an accident, or even there is random drug testing of bus drivers. FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, has gained a lot of traction in school districts in the past probably 5 years. I would suggest that you become familiar with how that works. There's a lot of conditions around it. However, more and more employees in my past experience are beginning to take advantage of this. The basics of the Family Medical Leave Act are that you have 12 weeks of leave. Now, how a district administers that, either with using sick leave pay or without it, is a matter of the school district's policy. Civil rights legislation, equality for women. This basically deals with maternity issues, and certainly that you can't discriminate in recruitment and selection, promotion and training because of a woman being pregnant. Sexual harassment in school districts. This is one of the major areas of that you would, as a school principal, deal with, both probably with students and with staff. One of the things that I would suggest to you is that this is an area that you as a leader need to be proactive in, the sense that you provide training both for staff and students in terms of what is sexual harassment, what constitutes a hostile working environment, and the whole idea around your ability to ask somebody to stop doing some particular action, language, touching, whatever it is. Again, I would suggest that you need to read up on this, understand it, and think about how you as a leader would project information and knowledge about this. One of the things that I've encountered, I think, as a school principal, and I'm not suggesting this to block giving out information about sexual harassment to middle schoolers, but it seemed like as soon as we talked about sexual harassment with middle schoolers, we had a rash of it break out in terms of either people accusing others of it or perhaps even acts of sexual harassment. I'm moving on to slide number 15. Slide number 15 deals with technology and the human resource planning function. A couple of things that I would mention here is that there are a number of human resource management system programs out there, software-wise, for school districts. Some of them are very good, some of them are not so good. One of the things that I would suggest to you is that if you get caught caught's not the right word, if you have to become involved in the choosing of the human resource management system, one of the things I would suggest to you is that you should bring on board all the people who are going to use this, allow them to both manipulate the software and also to be part of the decision-making process. There is some planning and forecasting software out there. I would suggest to you that probably Excel is as good a tool for doing this as any of this planning and forecasting software. That's my opinion. I think you can do just about the same functions with some careful planning in Excel.